Hello, everyone. My name is Chris Goettl. I'm Vice President of Product Management at Ivanti for our endpoint security products. And today I am joined by Srinivas Mukkamala. Srinivas has recently joined Ivanti from RiskSense. So some of you may have read up on recently, we had a recent acquisition. Ivanti has purchased RiskSense. They are focused on risk-based vulnerability management, and Shree's going to talk about that a little bit more in just a few minutes. But Shree and I wanted to talk a little bit today why Ivanti is, made this purchase, how RiskSense is helping us to expand and really push modernization in a number of areas. And, really exciting to have you here with us today, Shree.
Thank you, Chris. Thanks for having me.
So, Shree, it's kind of interesting when people ask about, acquisitions that we've done. There's usually a really interesting story behind that. So I wanted to start today by talking about, the kind of the two sides of that story. So I was going to share the part about where, me and my team, started to look at a very specific challenge for our patch management customers. Ivanti has been a very strong player in the patch space for many years. We saw a really significant challenge. Companies were struggling to really try to accelerate their ability to remediate vulnerabilities. And there were a number of blind spots. There's a number of barriers. And we were trying to just automate more effectively the handoff between the security analyst and, vulnerability assessments and how they're prioritizing and handing that off to operations. We found that, there was some easy ways that we could help our customers to shave even a full day or more off of their remediation process, what's referred to a lot of times as time to patch. What we didn't expect as much is to uncover more and more, pain points within there about how bad the blind spots of prioritization really were. So let me give an example here of where that became kind of a really big challenge. There was a number of ways that companies were prioritizing to try to understand which updates they should be pushing. Yet, no matter what we did, there were still a number of companies that were being exposed to vulnerabilities that were plugged years ago. The average shelf life for a known exploited vulnerability is 7 years. So that's a bit of how we started this journey in looking for a way to help our customers to accelerate and plug a few gaps in prioritization. Now, Shree, you guys have been in the space around prioritization of vulnerabilities for quite a while. Tell us a bit about RiskSense and how you guys you really came to be.
Thank you, Chris. It's pretty interesting, right? There's always a friction. You talked about a friction on the operations side. We saw the friction on the security side. So every single time we walk in, and the first question is, we can't get our guys to patch enough. I'm like, okay, what does it really mean, right? What numbers are we talking about? I mean, they can't even patch. So you start hearing this subjective things. Then we started looking at the data. So what's a real challenge? Number one, right? They're trying to boil the ocean. A patch comes out, you want to go rush patching it. And we tell the security guys too, hey, that's not the right thing to do. Why? Why are we wasting resources? You always complain you don't have enough staff in your operations team. At the same time now, what really happened the last 2-3 years is, as everybody is moving towards their cloud journey, you don't have your Windows anymore, right? You're going to start thinking about your real assembly line. You cannot stop the assembly line. So they started seeing the real pain. Engineers now pushing back. Give us enough reason why I should apply a patch. And that's when we started looking around. Oh my God, this is going to be a real big problem. Not only we have prioritized, but we also need to clearly tell them why, what, and how, right? So we know why, because there is an exploit, it's trending, it's used by the bad guys. We know what, to some degree, based on all the data we are curating, how it becomes a problem, right? We're not a patch management solution. We're still passing off the puck to somebody else, say, go patch this, do this. And that's where we started seeing a very interesting synergy. And we said, which patch management vendor we should partner with? I mean, it's pretty obvious, right? I mean, I always joke with fellow CEOs, Ivanti is the best kept secret. I mean, you go under the hood. I mean, who is really the engine for all these security vendors? People are using Ivanti's content. And that's when we started gravitating towards Ivanti to say, hey, you need the prioritization, which you all are trying to cobble together. We need the patch we're trying to cobble together. Does it make sense to share two best contents ever, right? So we have good content, you have the best content. How do we come closer?
Absolutely. And, that was where, again, use cases that we both were seeing years ago finally culminated in this acquisition here. And really, this is an exciting moment for both the security and the operations team. So Shri talked a little bit about this massive number of vulnerabilities that the security team is trying to influence the operations team to go plug many of these. So let's talk about that for a minute here. So Shri, this is some data that you're very familiar with, obviously. We've looked at the data that RiskSense has visibility on, and we've been mapping that to what the Ivanti patch catalog has. So in a second here, you're going to see up on screen, we're going to show you how much vulnerability data is really out there. And we're going to start to go through and really talk about how best do we get organizations to prioritize and really take action on what matters most. So, the first challenge is, there's over 200,000 unique vulnerabilities out there. Now, Shri, this is more than just, OS and software vulnerabilities, right? This is configuration. This is IoT devices, hardware, and other things. Like, out of those unique vulnerabilities, we kind of separate this out into what's easily patchable and kind of what's in the everything else bucket. Now, if you look at that, I've had this conversation many times. You can't just go and patch a huge platform like SAP. You can't go and just patch complex database systems like an Oracle database or multi-tiered applications. Typically, those are things that you have to have a project and you have to have a team of people who are going to go and do updates across many different systems and roll it out in a very controlled manner. And then there's the easy updates, what patch management solutions on the market are really helping to provide. So we can help a significant amount of those vulnerabilities go away very quickly. Now, again, this is a whole lot of vulnerabilities that any organization is going to struggle to keep up with. Now, the interesting thing about RiskSense is in funneling down to what really matters. So Shri, you guys, the term weaponized starts to come out in the RiskSense data very quickly. This is what really matters for organizations here, right? So what exactly does it mean to have a vulnerability be weaponized?
So definitely, Chris, I mean, we have to always remember, like how the good guys want to spend the time, the bad guys are there trying to take a weakness and they're trying to build code that would exploit that, right? So the whole concept of trying to go right and exploit for an existing vulnerability is weaponization, right? I mean, if you just remove the whole concept, the rate at which the weaponization is happening is not high. It sounds high because in the last 5 years, the attackers are constantly trying to do this. But if you look at it, only of the known vulnerabilities are weaponized. In a way, it's a good news, right? However, the challenge is they're being used quite rapidly. The frequency at which they're getting used, the efficacy of the exploits have gone up exponentially. So that's the whole point of weaponization. And you only have 10% you should ever care about.
Right. Now, the one thing that's very interesting about this is this type of data is, you'd think that this would be more tangible. You'd think that the way that vendors are prioritizing, the way that CVSS scoring, for those of you on the more of the analyst side, that's the scoring mechanism that the analysts use to try to rate the severity of a vulnerability as well. You would think that things like, is it weaponized, would really start to come out there more. You'd also think things like, is it remote code execution capable? So this is remotely exploitable, a lot of times even without authentication being required. And then even things like, can we provide social trending around this to show, what's being most actively used. So this is where I'm going to bring up an example here. This is very recent. Microsoft, it's Patch Tuesday, by the way. Many of you know this and are going to be busy throughout the rest of the day here and tomorrow and the next week or two trying to remediate vulnerabilities coming out. But in the last 2 patch cycles, Microsoft had a lot of zero-day vulnerabilities that were resolved. In 36 days, they had 10 zero-day vulnerabilities that they had released updates for. Now, of those, there were a number of those that Microsoft only rated as important. So actually 3 out of 10 were rated as critical. So I've talked to a number of companies who their way of prioritizing on the ops side to say, hey, these are the things we're going to take action on is if the vendor says it's critical. Okay, so Shri, 10 vulnerabilities actively being exploited before Microsoft released an update, only 3 of which were rated as critical by Microsoft. All right, that's blind spot number 1 on the operations team. So let's look at the security side. CVSS scoring, those same 10 vulnerabilities, none of those were a 10.0. Only 2 of them were up in an 8x range. The rest of them were lower than 8.x. In fact, 3 of those vulnerabilities only had a 5.2 or a 5.5 CVSS scoring rate. So when we talked about this on a couple of our recent Patch Tuesday webinars, a number of people were like, wait a second, this is actively being exploited. I thought that when that happens, it's automatically critical. It's automatically rated higher by CVSS. That's not exactly the case. So why is that, Shri? Why do these blind spots exist?
It's a very important question, Chris. I mean, that's why people like RiskSense, Kenna, we all exist, right? CVSS is a good scoring baseline. Never deny the fact it has improved from 2 to 3.x, right?
Mm-hmm.
They've done a very good job. One thing we all have to remember, CVSS is a baseline. They expect you to go do your temporal data. They expect you to go do your environmental data. The temporal piece is very interesting. CVSS doesn't take a definitive weaponization into consideration. That is a fundamental flaw. It's the likelihood they take or the ease of exploitation, but what they don't do is, do I have a known exploit readily available, and will I use that to change my base score? See, that's where it gets very interesting, right? CVSS is a good starting point, but it's not a guiding path. And that's where we need to start with something. That's all we all started with. And now that's why we have RiskSense VRR, we have Kenna's scoring model, we have Tenable's VPR. All of us have scoring models.
Mm-hmm.
The interesting piece, one thing you'll see in any one of ours, is really the bottom line is we take definitive information. Do we have a known exploit or not? That is the number one thing we look for. That's our weaponization. However, you clearly articulated it. Where do we start getting interesting? We just don't sit and look at the metadata. Somebody can write an exploit and label it as a remote code execution, right? It might not be. So one of the interesting things, what you have to do as a security analyst or as a weaponization expert is you go study the code, you go study the comments, you go look at the behavior aspect of the exploit. That's a very humanly intense thing. So that's where you can take NLP and a few examples of machine learning to see, can I label this fast enough, and only look at the ones where a human needs to use his judgment. That is the key here. One, weaponization is already big, right? If you look at 10%, that's still a big number when you look at it in a grand scheme of things. But when you start looking at 6,400, it gets interesting. It's less than 3%, right?
Right.
Look at that. It's less than 3%. I'm not happy even at that number. So what do we do? The social aspect you talked about, is it trending? Is it actually used? Is it actually being used by bad guys? Is it part of a ransomware? Is it APT groups? Is it won by the feds? So you start collating different warnings, signal strengths, and you come to the trending aspect. Now you're getting interesting. You're less than 0.01%. I think that's where we should focus. And Gartner clearly said it well after years and years of research. Last year, finally, they came out and said, no more patching everything, guys. You cannot do it. At the same time, no more bulk correlating with threat intel. That's not going to work either. So you got to look at three things: your vulnerability, your threat, and your impact. But if really it's your base score, it's your environmental score, and it's your temporal score, right? If you look at the terms, in simplistic terms, is it actively being used? Is it an asset that you care? Is that vulnerability even worth looking at? So when you put all that together, then I would just start with this 46 patches first. If I see anything there, I'm just going to go apply, boom, right? Because you have enough context and you have reduced the work, you removed the triage, and you brought operational efficiency.
So let's take a look at why. So risk-based vulnerability management. Sri mentioned Gartner. Gartner actually has some analysis around this. They're estimating that companies who adopt a risk-based vulnerability management approach, patch being part of that, you have to patch what you've identified, obviously. Companies that adopt this type of approach and embrace it effectively could reduce the number of data breach incidents they have each year by 80%. So however many incidents you had last year, reduce that by 80% by shifting to this. Now, why is that? Actually, I get a really good example, Sri. So there's a company called Coveware. Coveware is, they help organizations that are hit by a ransomware attack to try to recover from it. They've got some extremely interesting data on this topic. This is from their quarterly reports from Q4 and Q1. So Q4 2020 to Q1 2021. What you'll see here is the number of software vulnerabilities that were being targeted in 2020 at the end of the year were a bit lower for the ransomware attacks that were being utilized. Rapid shift over into Q1, there were a number of vulnerabilities that they started targeting and a massive shift towards those software vulnerabilities. This is why that risk-based approach is so important. If we can't get visibility on what's trending amongst these threat actors and be able to react very quickly to what's working very effectively for them, we're never going to get ahead of cybersecurity challenges like ransomware. So when it comes to these threat actors, I think that one of the things that really excited us the most about RiskSense is the way that you guys are showing these types of trends, and especially the trend amongst ransomware, especially. So talk to me a little bit about that, the ransomware threat actors, and a little bit about what you guys are doing to get a handle on and help people to understand how they can get ahead of rapid shifts in these threat actors like this and try to stay ahead of real dangerous threats like ransomware.
It's a very good question, Chris, and a very timely question, right? So if the industry recalls, 2016 is when we started calling ransomware will be a nuisance, will convert, and will transform into being a disruptor. When we first said that in 2016, the industry looked at, what are these guys even talking? It's petty theft, right? It's like another phishing scam. We were bold to call that. And what we did was, rather than just calling it, we started tracking the data. I mean, we consider ourselves building a knowledge graph. What that really means is we first look at a weakness. A lot of people don't look at weaknesses. They start with a CVE. It's a fundamental flaw. CVEs are very important, don't get me wrong. But we want to know what led to the CVE. That's your common weakness, right? We started studying what weaknesses are actively being exploited. So we looked at the weakness, we started looking at the CVE, then we started looking at the payloads, what exploits are they writing. The latency, how much time it's taking for the bad guys to write an exploit or the good guys to write an exploit and release, so bad guys will use it, right? The latency metrics were very important. There were 3 latency metrics we were tracking. Exploit written before a vulnerability was disclosed, exploit written after vulnerability is disclosed, the 0 days you talked about. Their exploit is already out. Then the vendors scramble to disclose a vulnerability. That's where attackers have always an advantage. Then we started looking at patch. Are we building a patch after an exploit is written or before an exploit is written, right? Again, that's a very important thing. So then we started looking at the disclosure itself. When are we disclosing the vulnerabilities? So the latency metrics really helped us understand what is going on, the weakness, the vulnerability, the payload. Then that was not enough. Then we said, how do we go further to really label it as an RCEP, which we just talked about in the previous discussion. And then we talked about, is it training? We said, can we now take that to the last mile and flag if it's using by a ransomware or a ransomware family or ransomware as a service? So to do that, you got to study the payloads that are capable of ransomware as a service. If the industry recalls WannaCry double pulsar, all that work was done at RiskSense. Then we had Bluekeep, then we had NetLogOn. We did quite a bit work to contribute to the whole ransomware as a thing. In 2019, we started publishing what's called a ransomware index. It's nothing but building this knowledge graph and clearly showing you the evolution from a weakness to a vulnerability to an exploit to what ransomware it is. It's very fascinating to see the trends, like what you're talking about. Actors started moving from typical operating system up the stack. Now they're moving to the web layer. They're moving to the libraries. They're moving to the frameworks. So we started seeing a big shift to layer 7 SaaS application actually being used as infiltration vectors. So it's very important to not only see the latency, the trends, but track it more on a continual basis and build this massive knowledge moat so we can share ahead with our customers so they can be proactive.
Yeah, absolutely. Paul pointed out, it looks like as I was pulling this slide together, I was taking some data from a previous presentation. I took a couple of slides and merged them together, and in the process, I didn't update this to 2021, but that is Q1 2021 that this links to. But yeah, that's in just a matter of 3 months. This is how quickly threat actors can move. And one of the things that, back to today's, name of the presentation that we're talking about here, how are we trying to evolve patch management going forward? So that's, Shri, that's where I want to wrap up today is how do we make that evolution? So there's 2 parts to how RiskSense and Ivanti are coming together. And it really comes back to, we've got 2 different personas, 2 different analysts involved. We've got the security team, who is trying to focus on the vulnerability management challenge as a whole. And this is more than just what needs to be patched. This might be software weaknesses in e-commerce, in large back-end solutions, in hardware, in software. It could be a variety of things there. And then the patch management solutions that can help you update many of those vulnerabilities, and often the ones that are most commonly exploited, much more quickly than trying to do it manually. So the first thing that I wanted to bring up is how the RiskSense content is coming into the Ivanti patch management experience. And then Shri will switch over to talk about the RiskSense side as well. So those of you who have been using Ivanti technologies for a while, you're probably familiar with technology that we've been developing called patch intelligence. So this was Ivanti looking at how can we better refine and provide visibility around a few different things. Patch reliability. If an update releases and you've got 50 test machines that you can work with, well, you're dealing with a law of small numbers. So we wanted to crowdsource and try to provide more visibility around reliability of those updates. Many of those updates are being deployed by our customers in as little as 24 hours from releasing the vendor. If we can show you thousands of systems that have pushed that same patch and give you a feel for how well that's performing in a very short period of time, you start to get the value of that crowdsourced level of telemetry versus trying to do it all yourself. Other things like social sentiment around that are another big addition there. You could start to see if there's an update that breaks away from the pack as far as how much people are talking about it. Are they talking about it because it's a major security concern, because it's a major operational impact, or it fixes a major operational issue? Those are the 3 typical ways that any update starts to break away from the pack, and you start to hear more and more chatter about it. So that patch reliability data is one key piece of that. The other major part of the experience that we were trying to do with patch intelligence was around that that exploit. What is, trying to bring up that blind spot. And this is where, going back to the how did we get to the RiskSense acquisition, it was that exploration, trying to do it ourselves. Okay, it'll take us a while to get there and really build out that data. Then we started to look at partnering, and that partnership conversation is really what led to finding this broader synergy that we had between our organizations and really make for an intriguing acquisition. So patch intelligence, for those who haven't taken a look at it, the RiskSense data is coming in here and providing that additional bit of visibility to understand what what RiskSense refers to as their VRR grouping and their VRR score. You'll see this start to actually refine some of the blind spots that we've talked about here and bring in the values and data about what's actively being exploited, what is tied to ransomware, and getting that level of visibility. So this is now integrated into patch intelligence. Now, Shri, the other part of this conversation is, that helps the operations team, but we've got this much broader security team challenge that's going on out there. And that's really where RiskSense is providing a lot more. So tell me a little bit more about RiskSense as a whole. You guys do, you have 3 products today. Tell us about what those are helping the security team to tackle.
No, definitely, Chris. So it's a very important thing, right? We call the first mile and the last mile. And when we talked about not every vulnerability is fixed via a patch, some of them need config changes, some of them need code fixes as well, right? So which means as a security analyst, you still have other stakeholders, your developers, right? And your network teams and sysadmins, not just the patching teams. While we really want to help the operations team from a patching perspective, we also have other personas. And that's where RiskSense really comes into play. While Ivanti, if you look at it, we are the underlying patch content for majority of the security vendors. We play well with everybody, right? I mean, while we have field competition, end of the day, it's our content that's actually being used. With RiskSense, that's exactly the philosophy. We integrate with every single major vulnerability diagnostic tool. Your Tenables of the world, Rapid7s of the world, your Qualys's of the world, your Checkmarks of the world, Veracodes of the world, Synopsys of the world, you name it, we take anything that has to do with vulnerability, right? We take source code data, we take black box data, we take open source data, we take your typical scanning at the infrastructure layer, cloud layer, container layer. We also ingest CMDB data. So the reason I'm giving you these examples is anything that represents an asset, anything that represents exposures on an asset, we ingest it. And that's where we try to find the best solution. So the 3 products we have is we have the RiskSense RBVM, risk-based vulnerability management. It is the primary goal there is to solve 4 use cases. Can we clearly tell you what your ransomware exposure is? That is the number 1 use case we solve. The second one is, what are the most trending exploits you should care about and do something about it? That's your prioritization use case. Then we go down and say, hey, as part of the prioritization, you should also look at anything that's remote code execution and privilege escalation. Reason why? If you look at the last 10 years, any major breach that was disclosed or incidents that happened, the underlying payload was predominantly an RCE or a PE, right? That's why we want to make sure you have things bubbled up. We also do something very interesting on the trending in RBVM. We look at every industry alert, we look at every government alert, and we actually do the triage, we do the exposure for you, and bring about 60% operational efficiency. So your teams are not going and researching the web, they're not doing the triage, they're not looking at the exposure analysis, and then coming and saying, this is what I'm exposed to. All that is done in seconds on a continual basis. The second one, what we have is Asoc, Application Security Orchestration and Correlation. So this is bringing in all your application vulnerability types, right? The source code analysis, the dynamic code analysis, the open source. And you also look at SCA, software component analysis. We bring all that data together from your native scanners that you're running to help your developers really prioritize which weaknesses they should fix, because it is very expensive to use your developers' time. If you think operations teams are taxed, developers, you're getting between a release and your developers' time. You're not going to win that argument, right? And you got to really prove, you got to help them be efficient and act fast. Then finally, what we have is the underlying data itself. We keep talking about content. You want to have some of the best content. And then this content we're talking about here is really the vulnerability and the threat content. And then all security vendors to prioritize those stuff as well.
Got it.
Those are three we have.
Awesome. And, I think in wrapping up today, I think the exciting time that we've got ahead of us here is, seeing the continual breakdown of the gaps between security and operations. I think, in kind of closing out, Shri, that's the thing that I'm most excited about here, is seeing the challenges that, our customer on the Ivanti side had with trying to get this better visibility of the world, trying to close these gaps faster. We've just really given them a leg up on trying to get there much faster with this integration with RiskSense. From an outlook perspective here, what do you see? What excites you most about our new opportunities together?
I call it the nirvana, Chris, the first mile and the last mile. The reason I say that is we're removing a very important barrier. Right now, it's security throws it off the wall. Pat says, I can't patch it. Nor I don't have resources. Or tell me why I should patch. This thing actually brings together something very interesting. It removes the friction between two teams, gives them some mechanism to collaborate, and really address the most important things to keep our stakeholders safe and secure. To me, that's a popular thing to get that thing together.
Awesome. Well, thank you, everybody. Again, a warm welcome to Shri and the entire RiskSense team in joining us here at Ivanti. There is a lot going on. We're going to have a great, experience coming together with things like patch intelligence and the broader RiskSense feature set. We've got a lot of existing Ivanti customers using our patching technologies. We are rapidly working on making sure that all of our patching technologies can connect up to patch intelligence and get an experience that brings that RiskSense data into their grasp. Actually, Brian just had a comment about that. He's using one of our patch technologies that we acquired from Heat Software and was asking about how that's going to come together. So Brian, even for EMSS and those of our customers on DSM, the patch intelligence experience is going to be available here very shortly as well. So definitely look forward to that, bringing together that experience for our customers and trying to rapidly speed up the process of that time to patch. More importantly, when we start to work with the broader security teams as well, making sure that we can bring our wealth of patch content as well into the RiskSense side and give them that visibility of what updates now can be applied to target those vulnerabilities that are being actively exploited in the wild. So Shri, thank you very much for joining us here today, and thank you everyone for joining us on this LinkedIn Live event.
Thank you, Chris. Happy to be a part of One Ivanti, Team Ivanti. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you all.